All right, well, welcome everybody. We're so excited for today's Riveter build on negotiation, which is something that I'm passionate about and Daniella is passionate about, and I'm sure that you are since you're here. So I wanted to introduce Daniella before we get started. So Daniella Kahane is many things, as you'll find out. She's a Peabody Award-winning filmmaker and content creator and producer for companies like Chevrolet, Honda, and HBO, and her films have played at top festivals, including Sundance, Tribeca, Toronto, Telluride, South by Southwest, and so many more. And so you might think that that would be enough of her resume, but it's not. So Daniella is also pertinent to today, the executive director and CEO of WIN, which stands for Women in Negotiation. And I met Daniella through WIN, and WIN grew from an annual summit on negotiating tactics and skills for women into a year-round program where WIN works with companies across the country, teaching workshops and coaching all around how professional women, whether they work on their own or they work for companies, can rise personally and professionally through negotiation skills, which is so important in the base of so many things for our careers. And this year's WIN Summit is April 19th, which we're so excited about. And I'll be speaking. It'll be really fantastic. And you're getting like thousands of dollars worth of negotiation training by coming, which is my favorite part. But today, what we wanted to talk about is Negotiation 101 and how we think about it. Daniella, welcome.
Thank you, Amy. So nice to be here.
So great to be here with you. Before we get into kind of talking about what negotiation is and why it is important, I wanted to talk about your connection to negotiation. So you come from a background as a filmmaker, a creator. How did you become passionate about negotiation and get involved in the teaching and coaching around it?
Totally. So my route into this position and this company is very, very unexpected. I have always loved negotiating. I just never realized that what I was doing was actually negotiation. And it wasn't until I attended the 2018 WIN Summit that it kind of exposed me to, oh, wow, this is formal negotiation training. This is actually what I've been doing and what I do in my daily life. And, you know, whether it's on a personal level, on a professional level, all these conversations I'm having where I'm like, I have a need here. This person has a need here. How do we kind of synthesize our needs? How do I problem solve in this conversation? How do I think creatively to actually walk away from this getting what I want, but also having the other person feel that they've gotten what they want? Well, hello, that's negotiation. But honestly, until I sat through the 2018 WIN Summit, I never thought about that as negotiation. Negotiation in my head was like this really icky thing that I didn't want to do, that, you know, I knew like I was probably supposed to. And it was sort of a zero-sum game. Like, let me take the most from you. How can I get one over you? It was not something that I actually thought about on a very critical or conscious level.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And so after the summit.
So I sat through the summit, and immediately after, I was absorbed by these incredible speakers who I ended up actually interviewing, which is a whole different story. But left the summit, and immediately one of my dear friends, who actually is, talk about today's conversation, a freelancer and a creative, she calls me up and she has this problem, and she has no idea, by the way, what I've just sat through, what I've experienced. And she's like, I'm so upset. I'm like, what's going on? She's like, this client I did all this work for them, and we arranged terms and, you know, have a contract, and now they're trying to double back. And after I've done the work, try and, like, you know, take money off the table. And I'm like, what? And she's not the most, you know, assertive person. And I kind of felt the sense of, there's an opportunity right here to intervene. And if I don't, she's going to just accept it and walk away feeling really upset and disheartened, but just sort of say, I'm not in a powerful position right now. What leverage do I have? And so I kind of just took everything that I had heard from the summit and ingested, and then channeled it towards her. And because of that, she then went and followed up with this client and asserted for herself what was fair and got what she wanted out of it. And it was such a beautiful, immediate domino effect of, wow, this is like part of our day-to-day, every day. And if we're not consciously thinking about this and acknowledging that what we're doing is actually negotiation, we're going to miss out on opportunities. We're not going to be claiming our value. We're not going to be articulating that. So yeah, it was a really beautiful kind of firsthand experience to kind of see that immediate impact of Win Summit in my own personal, friend's journey in life.
That's amazing. That's awesome. I love that. I think it's so important for us to think about like our connections to the issues that we're really passionate about.
Yeah.
For so many years as a lawyer, I didn't realize I could negotiate my salary. And then or your bonus or anything, which everything in the world can be a negotiation if you open your mind to it.
Totally. No, I mean, truth be told, I'm like embarrassed to admit this, but I tell people I didn't negotiate my first salary.
Yeah.
I was just so grateful to have
Yeah.
that opportunity, that the fact that it was like barely minimum wage, I didn't care. I was like, yes, thank you. And the truth is, I missed out on an opportunity there. And there's a crazy statistic out there, which you may know, where if women don't negotiate their first salary, they are giving themselves an impediment of losing up to $1.5 million of salary over the course of a lifetime. Because, and this obviously applies especially in a corporate context where you peg yourself at a certain rate. And then it's very hard to catapult up a leg or a lift, right? Because companies are so regimented about those salary increases based on, department head title and all that stuff and where you're at. And so it's just crucial. It's so important to actually be thinking about these things and to make those asks.
It makes so much sense. Now, turning to freelancers and creatives.
Yeah.
So, we see so many women pivoting into this arena or using it as a side hustle while they're in corporate America or thinking about making the pivot. I read some crazy statistic somewhere that like 80% of women in corporate America are considering pivoting into the freelance economy, which makes sense, right? Like, the wage gap is stubborn and won't close. So one of the benefits of going and making money on your own is that you get to set your rates. And so I wanted to dive into why, well, first of all, before that, why negotiation is important, but what is negotiation to you? What is a way for us to think about it before we dive into it?
Yeah. No, I love this question. It seems so basic, but actually it's not. So when we've been conducting a negotiation survey for women for the past few years, and we've had hundreds of responses, probably 1,000 at this point. And it's really shocking to me because 99% of the time when people say, when we ask, like, how often do you negotiate? The answer is, oh, once a year. And we're like, wait, what? So that to me is a red flag in the sense that if you think you're negotiating once a year and the next thing is probably, okay, well, that once a year is probably around salary or performance review, then you are totally missing the boat on what negotiation is. So the reframe that we want to do at Win Summit, and this is like so fundamental to our vision and our mission, is acknowledging or helping women acknowledge that negotiation is something that they're doing day in, day out. Every day throughout the day, you are negotiating, whether it's with your children, your spouse, your dry cleaner down the block, your maitre d', your colleague, your boss, your partner, like whatever. Any interaction you have where you care about the outcome of that conversation, that's a negotiation.
I love anything where you care about the outcome of that conversation. That's great and encompasses everything. We should do a separate Riveter build on how to negotiate with your small children because I very much care about the outcomes of those conversations.
By the way, that is a passion topic for me because I have, as you know, a 2-year-old and the terrible twos is real. And they are little tiny terrorists and you need to be so skilled. It's like hostage negotiations. It can be really intense. And honestly, like with the skills that I learned from that in terms of like the same things I'm taking away from how I'm parenting apply in business negotiation. It's really,
I believe it though. Although I can't like in business negotiations be like, you're not getting your nighttime snack. But yeah, bribery is not a great negotiation.
No, well, and by the way, I try not to use bribery because I find it's counterproductive. It doesn't work.
100%.
Even though it's like so understandable that we want to go there because we're like, we have the power, we can take things away. It actually in the long term it's not effective. And so like a lot of what I like to talk about is sort of effective negotiation, right? Like what are the things that might seem a little counterintuitive to us in terms of how we relate to the negotiation that actually then give us a far more effective outcome?
Makes sense. Makes total sense. Okay, so we now have a framework for what negotiation is. So why is it so important for freelancers, creators, and creatives?
Yeah. Because you are, I mean, as freelancers and creatives, you are steering your own ship all the time professionally, right? Negotiation is important for everybody, but especially as a freelancer or creator, where you need to be able to articulate your own value because your income wholly depends on it on a micro way, right? Like your time, and everybody's time is their greatest asset. Eve Rotsky has an incredible quote where men's time are perceived like diamonds, whereas women's time is perceived like sand. And I think it's like this visual that encapsulates the problems that we have as society today. And honestly, we need to take the accountability in terms of how we relate to this, because oftentimes as a woman, you feel the need to want to show up for other people, to want to say yes to the extra thing, to want to, and a lot of it has to do with, oh, I know I'm competent, so I can just do it. I can just, it won't take me long, right? But all of those things do add up, and they take away from where you could be, wanting to prioritize and value your time. And so as a freelancer, as a creator, when you are wholly responsible for your productivity and your income on a micro kind of time-based, right? You have a finite amount of time to take on a finite amount of projects. It's all the more critical that what you are choosing and how you are negotiating your value is really top of mind. Like somebody who works in a corporate position who doesn't have, sort of these extra things, they do negotiate. They're negotiating every day, but not when it comes to how much are they getting compensated, right? That happens once a year.
Right.
And then they can kind of put that in a box and put it away. As a freelancer, as a creator, that is a conversation you need to be having on a constant basis. So all the more reason you need to get really comfortable negotiating.
So a lot of people don't think about negotiations happening until they're in the moment. But I think, when I've been at Win Summit before, one of the big conversations and topics is prepare to negotiate, which is so important.
Yes.
Because you wouldn't go run a marathon without having prepared or trained. So what are some best practices for preparing to negotiate?
Yeah, I mean, so much of a negotiation happens before you even walk into the room or send the email or, get on the Zoom screen. So, and I guess the catch-22 with this, which is why we need to kind of stress it so much, is that naturally, psychologically, when we don't like doing something, we avoid it or we procrastinate, right? And so we don't give ourselves the bandwidth to then actually do the preparation because we're too kind of busy in our day-to-day and we're avoiding the thing that makes us uncomfortable. And since negotiation, we know, makes most women uncomfortable, we're effectively not preparing adequately. So absolutely, a big part of preparation has to do with really getting clear on what you need out of this negotiation, right? So we like to kind of frame it with there's people call it the 3 W's. So your walk, your want, and your wish. So you need to really and there are other kind of terms for this as well, floor, ceiling, things like that. But really kind of pin down these 3 benchmarks for yourself in terms of if this is a monetary negotiation, right? But it doesn't have to be. This applies for any negotiation. What is like my wish outcome in this situation? What is my walk away point in terms of, okay, I will not deal with this, or I will not, go further with this conversation if this happens? And what is my want? Like, what is the thing that I'm going to be satisfied with? That is going to kind of, be good enough, I guess. And so those are really 3 things that you need to figure out for yourself before you embark on that negotiation, because it'll help you steer when you're in the negotiation, right? So a lot of times when you're in the conversation, it's very easy to get sideswept, and it's very easy to forget sort of what was my target anyway, and what was I trying to get out of this? And so if you have those 3 benchmarks very clearly delineated, then it's kind of just it's like, oh, okay, red light, orange light, or yellow light, green light. I always say orange light for some reason. My kids always correct me. So yeah, so that's really important. Did you want to say something, Billy?
What I was going to ask is, if you're new to freelancing or new to the creator space, and what do you do when you first, like, you don't know what your walk, your want, and your wish are? Like, what do you do at that point? Like, is it research online
Yeah,
to figure out like what other people are
exactly.
charging, or?
So that was my next thing. So you have to understand the context, and obviously we're like talking in abstract, so it's a little bit hard because there's so many varieties of negotiations that you will have as a freelancer or creative. But if, for instance, you're taking on a client, you need to know a lot about that client before you
Mhm.
can actually walk into a negotiation in terms of a contract negotiation with them, or a deal negotiation, right? So who is that client? Depending on who that client is, that'll dictate what the rate is. Where is this client based? Depending on, kind of where this company or individual is based, that could also dictate the rate, right? And doing your research in terms of your own sort of what you should be, especially for somebody like you said, who's starting off, what you should be charging. And obviously there's always going to be a range within that. But doing the research in terms of what is the reasonable range,
Mhm.
and then figuring out, okay, well, where within that reasonable range are you going to be satisfied, or are you feeling? And I think the thing that I want to stress is that often we do undervalue ourselves. So best to like get a pulse with other people on that
Mhm.
range before you pin yourself down. So I find it very helpful to talk to my husband because
Mhm.
men often don't have these issues with value. I say, like, you made this beautiful analogy of you wouldn't show up to a marathon not having trained.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, using that analogy, we often show up to like the marathon with like, can you imagine trying to run a marathon with 20 pounds or 40 pounds of weight around you?
No.
Like, yeah, I'm gonna run this marathon, but I would just strap this 20-pound, weight around my waist and do it that way. Well, that's how we show up to negotiations oftentimes, but because that added weight around us is
Mhm.
really the impediment we have to oftentimes to acknowledging or articulating for ourselves and for others our own value.
That's really interesting. It's a really interesting way of looking at it. Um, okay, so getting really clear on what you want out of the
Getting
negotiation and understanding the context. Is there anything else we can do to prepare to negotiate?
Yeah, this is also counterintuitive, but get really clear on what your counterpart wants. This is
Mhm.
a superpower, like knowing not just what your needs are, but what their needs are in the situation. And everything you can do to flesh that out, whether it's an intake call with them, whether it's research online, whether it's actually maybe somebody in your network that knows this client or a person has worked with them before. Like the more you can get clear on who they are and what their needs are in this situation, the more leverage and the more power you're going to have in that
That's so
conversation.
smart. Yeah, that makes so much sense. I always, when I talk about fundraising, which is what I've done a lot of, I always tell people the amount of work I did before I went to my first fundraising pitch was more than I would ever do in the actual pitches, right? Like
Oh
there's so
yeah.
much work in the before.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Because you don't know, again, this could be an email, this could be a Zoom, this could be an in-person. Negotiations happen in all different contexts. And that's also something to be negotiated in the sense of you want to be thoughtful about how is this going to happen? Is it best to have an in-person meeting? Is it best to do a Zoom? And like case by case, there's no one fit, one size fits all type of thing. But the more you know going into it, the more you can then creatively problem solve, right?
Yep.
When you're in it.
Yep. And I'm sorry, just to note, a
Yeah.
few people just messaged me that the chat is not enabled, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to
Oh
figure out.
no. I'm wondering why it's such a quiet audience
I
today.
know, this is me. That was my fault. Trying to figure out how to do it. So someone stay tuned for 1 second. Okay, so there we are, I think, with everything with preparing for a negotiation. Do you think we have it covered? The kind of three big pieces to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are three huge buckets. And obviously within that, a lot of little things go into that. So
Mhm.
yes, those are, I would say, like the three really big. Doing your research about, the client, knowing everything you can about what they want to get out of it, doing your own research in terms of like more the internal work that needs to happen in terms of your bandwidth, what would be a walk of, a wish and a want for you in the situation. Also then doing the research around like your value based on, especially, the market rate, especially if you're new to this and you don't have
Mhm.
existing rates, kind of taking a pulse check around that with other people in your industry, who obviously are aligned or not competitive with you, but supportive of you. And what was the other thing we said?
We talked about getting clear with what we need out of negotiation, understanding the context, and getting really clear with what our counterpart needs.
Yes, exactly. And then figuring out what the best format is for you in terms of that negotiation.
Mm-hmm.
The last thing you want to do is feel pressured in terms of like, oh, I have to negotiate right now because they said so.
Right. When you talk about the format, I wanted to dig into this a little bit because some people are really afraid to have that kind of face-to-face conversation. It doesn't make somebody weak. It doesn't make them bad. It's just some people just aren't kind of like in that mindset and don't like that. Is it okay to negotiate over email? Is it okay to negotiate over like proposals? Or is that something that we should try to steer away from?
So I think, first of all, a lot of the reason why a lot of people are not comfortable negotiating in person is because they're viewing it as this adversarial thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're thinking, this is going to be confrontational. This person doesn't want to give me what I want. They're setting themselves up for something that is going to be sometimes hostile, right? And like that often is actually the opposite of what it will be and what we want it to be. And so my first kind of plead in terms of like how you view negotiation is, can we sort of shift away from this, it's an aggressive, hostile conversation where by default, this company or this client is not going to want to give me what I want, to actually, this is a collaborative process. We want to create a win-win solution out of this, right? So like just by going in with a more positive, open, collaborative approach, you are 10 times more likely to be successful. So that's for starters. The in-person is great in terms of building rapport. No matter what, across the board in negotiation, it's been proven that when there's rapport and when there's goodwill and when there's a relationship, you are far more likely to succeed in your negotiations. And I feel like this is intuitive, right? Like we know that with people who we have good relationships with, people who we trust, people who we feel want the best for us, we are much more likely to be giving and to want to, meet people where they're coming from. When you find yourself in a conversation, which is adversarial, where you feel like this person is trying to get something over me, where you feel like you're not being treated fairly, you are immediately going to shut down. And so that goes both ways. And so I feel like it's really important to definitely approach this as somebody who you want to be in a partnership with, who you want to be on the same team with, even in your, obviously you get there after you kind of, most people are like, okay, well, I'll just get through this negotiation, this contract, and then I'll be on their team, right? You want to start that way. So anything you can do to build trust, build rapport, show the client that you are really vested and concerned with what their needs are out of this. Even just articulating things that you think are like obvious, but aren't being said, can make your counterparty feel really valued and give you such an advantage over, 10 other freelancers they're talking to.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So, and thinking about that.
So I didn't fully answer the question. So the point is, I really think it's a two-pronged approach. Like, yes, there is a value to writing and to things being contracted, and that's important, and you want to protect yourself, and they want to protect themselves, right? But there is also a time and a place for that in-person, that Zoom, that face-to-face piece of the negotiation.
And okay, so I understand the in-person and the written and how, you can piece them together, but we talked about trust and feeling comfortable. Inevitably, there's going to be pushback, right? It's very unlikely that the first thing somebody proposes will be accepted.
Yes.
And so, pushback is one of the hardest things to deal with in negotiation, particularly for people who don't love negotiating. So how do you prepare to deal with that part?
Yeah. So first of all, like I said before, don't feel pressured to respond in the moment. I think a lot of people feel like, oh, I have to tell them right now in this conversation, and you don't. There's oftentimes time is your friend in the sense of, and within limits, obviously. I wouldn't expect to wait a week and then get back to them because they probably will have moved on. But respectfully, if you feel caught off guard by a pushback and you're like, oh, well, I really am not ready to respond to that or concede to that immediately, you can always say, I appreciate what you're saying. I'm going to give it some thought and I'll get back to you within 24 hours. Right. So like putting a reasonable time frame on it gives you time to actually think, okay, so this is what they're asking for. Well, first of all, does this fall within my wish and my want, right? Because obviously if it does, that gives you an answer. If it doesn't, what else can I do? If this is a client I really want to take on, where can I find more value? And that's something that I think also, like, I like to talk about a lot of negotiation in the sense that it's problem solving. It's creative problem solving at its core. And oftentimes we just approach it like this way. But sometimes if we're thinking, okay, well, maybe the dollar amount is not what I wanted, but they're offering this, then it gets me even further in the long term. And so having that approach in terms of, thinking creatively is really important. And it's hard to do that on the spot sometimes. So buying time is your friend.
What are some things to think about in terms of, we always think about money when we're thinking about negotiation, particularly for freelancers, consultants. I think about it, we do some consulting at the Riveter. Obviously, Riveter freelancers do their projects, but it's not just money. And when you talk about finding creative solutions, like, okay, you could talk about payment terms. What are some other things that we could put on the table as freelancers, creators that we can negotiate with besides money?
So, I mean, obviously exposure, depending on who your client is, if they're going to give you amazing exposure, that's a huge asset. Or referrals. Like, there are people who are like just super spreaders in the best way. This term is taken on a very negative connotation. But, they're the people that are like going to be your best cheerleaders and send you tons of business, outside of just like exposure through big brand names or whatnot. And so if somebody is like that, you might want to actually come down off your rate, because it's going to pay in spades over the long term. Right. Credit, right? So how visible is your work going to be in terms of like they're sharing that credit, or the quantity of work? Is this going to be a repeat, relationship potentially where that they have like a big pipeline of projects that they're going to need assistance with, and this is something that if you get this one and you nail it, you're going to most likely be the one that's going to get the rest of them. Because honestly, a lot of companies, they're a little bit lazy, right? Like they don't have to have like, they're going to go back to their first person who's done a good job because it saves them time. Right. And they know it's a proven thing, right? Like they've gotten through that one. So it's like having that long-term approach, not just that short-term approach. And it goes in the flip side too, right? Because we all know, and as somebody, I'm a freelancer myself and a creative, so I can empathize fully. Sometimes there are difficult clients out there who, in retrospect, you're like, oh God, I wish I hadn't taken that one on. So, I think that is something to think about, not just in the positive, but also in the negative, in terms of how do you protect yourself from those clients as well.
So interesting. Here's a big one that I think we should all talk about and be prepared for, even though we don't want it. It's like, what do you do when you're negotiating and you send your offer and it's just a no? There's not even kind of a counter. Like, how do you deal with that? Asking for a friend. It's definitely never happened to me.
Yeah.
No, it's definitely happened to me.
I love to say embrace the no. So I think so much of the time we're like afraid of the no, right? Because we think it's like a hard stop. To me, the no is just oh, okay, so that's information. They're not okay with that. Why? It's always like the next thing is why. We have to get behind the no to a why. And I do this with my kids all the time, right? Like they're in a conflict. One of them doesn't want to share something. One of them doesn't want to go first. One of them, I don't know what the conflict is, but it's always like, okay, but why? And how can we find a way to work together, right? Because I think that's really the question you want to be asking. It's sort of like, okay, that's a piece of information. They're not happy with this proposal. How can we adapt to, how can we find a way to make this something that they will say yes to? And whether that's with the same person and kind of having that conversation. Well, what about this didn't work for you? I'm curious. This is something I really love the opportunity to engage on. How would this look different if, this were to be something you wanted to take on? So ask them for more input. The other thing is like, there's usually another, I guess the other thing, if that doesn't work, is like, okay, not now. So sometimes no is just not now. And then it's important to go back, because that's the other thing I think a lot of people feel when they get a no. It's like rejection for life. I can never talk to this person again.
Yeah.
I can never. And I know with myself, like sometimes it takes asking 3 times to get a yes. And then that yes is incredible. And it totally changes the trajectory of something. So
Completely.
don't take no as the be all end all. Find a way to have it work for you in the sense of A, what information does this provide me? And how do I figure out a way to get around that?
So smart. I love it. That's great. Okay. So how do you deal with difficult clients? There's so many. First of all, like how can clients be difficult without looking around corners? But
I
then
feel like we should ask the audience this.
Does anyone in the audience have any, like have you experienced any difficult clients? Any examples you want us to go over or hypothetical scenarios? Because people can be difficult, right? Everyone is focused on their own needs and wants. And
and also like I think the hard thing about freelancing for creatives specifically is that often it's like a taste issue, right? It's hard to like be objective when it comes to taste, right? So what if you are, I don't know, a graphic designer and your, deliverables have been met and the client is just not happy with them, right? Because it's just not what they had in their head, right? Like that gets really, really tricky, because it could be all contracted out, but then at the end of the day, if you're a freelancer and you're creative, you also want your client to be happy because it is your reputation, right? Like, so that's where I think like it gets really sensitive for freelancers specifically who are in the creative field.
And
I would say, I would say in that situation, there's 2 things. Number 1 is do everything you can to communicate your style in advance, right? So like the more that your client knows about your aesthetic or what your kind of specific style is, the better, because the more they're likely to understand what they're getting into, right? So like that fit is very important. And this is also where contract comes in terms of the specific deliverables and the rounds of revisions that are entailed in something. Because I know when I think of difficult clients I've had, it often can be like, okay, this was supposed to be 2 revisions and it's become 8, right? So at what point is done? And so I think that like you can be generous of spirit and say, maybe in this case, because the relationship is so important, I'm going to go outside of the letter of the law of the 2 revisions and do a 3rd. But after that point, I'm going to be very factual about the fact that, this contained 2. We did a 3rd. I understand you're not happy. I really want to make you happy. How about we add to this contract an additional, 4 revisions at this rate so that we can both walk away feeling good about this, right? So I think there's ways to set your boundaries around your time because that is your biggest asset, but also show your partner or client or collaborator that you really want them to be happy in this situation.
Yeah. So you mentioned something that I want to go back on. And we're talking about like, say you had 2 revisions in the contract and they want 8. And Bobby just asked, what about those clients who keep asking for extra things? And it was something that Daniella, you and I have talked about before. How do freelancers protect themselves from situations like that?
Yeah. So
you can certainly choose to go outside the bounds of your contract or whatever, but how do you protect yourself? And then Abby will get to your comment too.
Yes. So that's a good question. And I think that this gets back to the preparation is key thing, because the more you know from them what they're looking for, the more you can build those extra things into the contract to begin with so that you can then properly account for your time, right? So if I know, obviously it's easier when you've worked with somebody before and you're like, oh my God, I know that they're going to be one of those clients that's going to like ask for X, Y, and Z. So I'm going to actually pad my contract with that and protect myself that way. But if it's somebody that, you've never worked with before and you don't know, that's why research is so important, both in terms of investigative research with them and also investigative research with the kind of external world in terms of know somebody who's worked with them before or know somebody within the company, right? So the more you have a sense of exactly kind of who they are and what they're going to want, the more you can actually integrate that into the contract from the get-go, which obviously serves you better in terms of your fee and your time.
Mindy commented something that I thought was really smart. She said, I learned early on in my content creation negotiations to be very clear that one round of revisions is allowed and give a flat fee for additional revisions needed. That's smart.
Yeah, exactly. So like I said, like you want to build that into the contract. And then if it goes beyond that, you can say, this is my fee for additional revisions.
So Abby mentioned that she was in a place, I think in her freelancing career that she needed to pay the bills. So she started taking on some clients that weren't paying her anywhere near what her value is. So if you need to do something like that, which Abby, I'm sure so many people go through something like this, and you need to reset, even with the same clients, what is a good way to approach that?
Are you asking Abby?
I'm asking you. I'm asking you to help with Abby in terms of
I didn't see your comment.
No, so, but yeah. How do you reset?
Yeah. I'm going to place my business. How do you reset with a current client?
Yeah. And then going forward with new clients, but with a current.
Exactly. It's really tricky because it's oftentimes, it's like that same hurdle I was talking about in terms of when you don't negotiate your first rate and then you're stuck at the same company and you're just stuck at a certain lower rate than you'd like to. It's often why people do leave companies and kind of shift to other companies to be able to kind of catapult themselves. So when you're, as a freelancer, when you're with a client that has kind of pegged you at a certain rate, I think that you need to make the case for why your rate has changed in a very, very factual way. And so, you can start with the work you've done kind of since then. Obviously, I don't know what the duration has been in terms of the time gap, but the work that you've done since then. And the other thing is like, there is, you have the normative of people raising their rates year upon year, right? So there is something that you can lean on that's kind of routinized, normalized within society that if you're not doing already with your clients, you definitely can be. So I would say that between those two things, between the, right, I haven't raised my rates on you since X, right, or ever, it's actually been X number of years because of the work that I've done in between X and Y, because of you want to make a list of it. Like you really want to listify everything that you've done that gives you this value that then, kind of allows you to make the argument for why they have been underpaying you or why you are, asking for a different rate now. I also think that, there's definitely different ways to like, I don't know the specifics of this situation. So it's hard for me to like, again, speak in the abstract in this case, but there definitely are different ways to gain value. And I know I mentioned this before from a client. So, I would say like, it's such a case by case basis when it comes to sort of a specific relationship, a specific client and a specific rate. But overall, you want to make sure that you are feeling like the sum math of this equation makes sense for you.
That makes sense. And I think that's probably always the question to go back to. That's a good one.
Yeah. And you feel like they have the power because you need this client, right? And so it keeps you where kind of stuck. But unless you ask, you won't know, right? So you need to get out of your own way that way. Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard.
It is. I want to ask one more question before we turn to the audience for questions. But, everyone will enter into agreements with clients. How do you find the framework of an agreement? And then how do you think outside the box when you need to about building the agreement?
Yeah, well, so obviously, if you have the luxury of being able to have a lawyer or an agent, that is always nice. If you don't, there's definitely boilerplates out there that you can use. But this is also where like your community is so key. Having resources within communities to other freelancers, other entrepreneurs, other creators, you should lean on them. And, it's the kind of thing, it's sort of like pay transparency in the sense that like, the more we band together with this information, the more control, leverage, and power you have as a community, right? So there definitely are communities for entrepreneurs and freelancers, and that's a place to like find resources when it comes to contracts, boilerplates, ranges of what's normal within rates. So I think that that's definitely something we should be more communicative of, and also conscious of when it comes to asking.
That's great. This has been so helpful in terms of like a big information download, with really great tactical tips, which is what we all want to walk away with. Does anyone from the audience have any other questions? Let me know.
The other thing I just want to add to Abby, to the question is, there's always this like timeless debate of, do I charge per hour? Do I charge per project? So I don't know what you've been charging for, like what the framework has been with your client previously in terms of whether it's a project fee or whether it's an hourly fee. But okay, I charge per project. So, it's like the kind of thing that you can also say, well, I'm finding that I'm spending X number of hours and it's not covering, right, what it needs to. So I'm actually going to switch to, and you don't have to do this across the board. You can just tell this one client you're doing it. I'm switching to an hourly fee and this is my fee, right? So that if you go over a certain number of hours, then it starts adding to your profit, in terms of the work. So I think that like freelancers do have both of those things, and to play with, or kind of to use to their advantage in terms of those different fee sort of models, right? And I think you could be creative with it, because some people say, oh, if I'm new, then I should just charge by the hour, but if I'm experienced, then I'm just going to charge by a fee. I don't think it's so black and white.
Very good way of looking at it. I feel like nothing is exactly that black and white, and can be a mix. And of things like that.
Yeah.
Like I've seen a lot of, so I don't think Mindy would be bothered by my saying this, but my colleague Mindy, we work with on a freelance basis, and she's a brilliant social media strategist, content creator. And we started with a setup fee and then an ongoing monthly project fee. And I think that was a great way, because the setup, as I know, as Mindy knew when she's pricing your services, is far more intensive, at the beginning, to understand the brand and start developing assets and do all these different things, then getting into a rhythm with saying, we'll do 3 posts a month, or, something like that. And so finding those different solutions and recognizing there can be different payment structures at different times.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that like you want to engender partners and clients that want you to feel good about your work, and you want them to feel good about your work, right? So like I always ask people when I'm negotiating with them, I always ask, like, how does this feel to you, right? Like, I want you to walk away happy in this situation too. And I feel like the more we can do that with each other, the more we're going to find our needs are getting met.
I love that. And that is something you never hear in the world, because I always say to my kids, and I'm talking to my kids, is just ask people how they're feeling a lot, like check in with people, because it's kind and it's being human. How are you feeling today? And when you think about it in business, like, how do you feel about this is probably the quickest way to an honest answer for everybody.
Yep, exactly.
The simplest things can be the most profound.
It's true.
Does anyone have any other questions? Might have one more that I had wanted to ask. You mentioned this, if anyone knows me, I deal with a lot of lawyers all the time, and I am a lawyer. But if you like, when should you get a lawyer? I mean, if you like, is it okay when you're starting out as a freelancer or creator or creative to, I don't know, go onto LegalZoom? Now I'm a brand pitcher for LegalZoom, but go onto a product like LegalZoom and download a contract, or just the internet and find it on Google, or like, do you need a lawyer from day one? Because they're expensive. They're expensive.
Yeah, no, you're so lucky you're a lawyer. I think that it's not fair to expect that freelancers and creatives can all afford lawyers, because they are really expensive. It might be the thing that you want to invest in because you're going to reuse it, and it's something that then you can kind of tweak to your benefit, but this is kind of protecting you. So every situation is different. I've definitely used boilerplate documents out there, when I felt it was good enough.
Mhm.
But I've also had lawyers draft things when I felt like it was necessary in that case. So I think it depends on the client. Oftentimes also a client will send you terms of contract of, what's the technical term for the contract now? I'm blanking, but it'll come from the client is the point. And so the question there is like, do you want somebody to look over that for you? And
Right.
I would say, yes, ideally you do.
Yeah, because they all have lawyers, like the big clients, they all have lawyers. So yes.
Yes, especially if it's filled with a lot of legal jargon that is hard to parse through.
Yeah.
So I would definitely, even if it's not your lawyer and you're not paying somebody who, officially, if you know somebody who you can say, hey, I got this contract, there's a few pieces of it that I'm just not understanding. Can you just break it down for me? I definitely would advise you to do that. So you know what you're signing. I think that's really important. And then, the kind of the basic terms of the contract in terms of the scope of work, the amount of it of revisions, the payment schedule, all those things, obviously you need to be really clear on. Don't sign anything unless you understand what, you're getting into that way.
That makes perfect sense. It's a big one. Lawyers always. But yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions? Otherwise, I think, I would encourage everybody to join Daniella and I at the WIN Summit, which will be a remarkable day. And it's virtual, so you can attend from anywhere.
And rewatchable.
Yep. And rewatchable. And again, it is just like this on steroids with 1,000 different opportunities to learn really tactical, very useful negotiation skills. The Riveter is proud to be a media partner of WIN Summit for this reason, because we've oriented around the idea of how can we be useful? And I think learning to negotiate and get paid the most that you can in the most favorable terms to grow the business that you want to grow is just the baseline of all of it. So Daniella, I wanted to say thank you. And I'll send a follow-up email to everyone here with a code so you can join us on the 19th.
Exactly. I think we said that everybody who's attended today is getting complimentary tickets to WIN Summit. So.
Okay, they are. Then we'll send you the code for free, and we'd love to see you there. Which is great. That's a huge gift. Thank you, Daniella. And so great. I loved being here today with you as always, and I can't wait to see you in New York.
Yeah, no, I'm so excited to see you, Amy. It's always good to talk to you, and it's really, really great to have this conversation with all of you. I hope everybody got something out of it. And my number one takeaway is just don't stop advocating for your worth.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you soon. Riveter Builds. You can find us on our website. We have an Eventbrite with our upcoming Riveter Builds. There's really amazing opportunities all the time. And if you join us as a member, you get access to a lot of Riveter Builds. And we are really working to narrow our own focus really to women making money in the independent economy. All genders welcome, but with a focus on women. So we're here to serve. So thank you so much. All right. Bye, everybody.